The U.S. Coast Guard says it's likely recovered human remains from the wreckage of submersibles. Debris.
On April 3, 1944, the Nazi German submarine U-455 suddenly vanished without a trace in the Mediterranean Sea, taking with it 50 officers and sailors who were on a combat patrol mission. There was no distress call, no debris washed ashore, not even a final Morse code signal. U-455 had completely vanished from all German Navy radar and communication systems, leaving a black void in the naval history of World War II. 66 years later, this secret was revealed when divers discovered the wreck lying 122 meters deep at the bottom of the Bay of Genoa. But what lay inside the submarine was even more terrifying. The entire crew was still trapped within. The hatches were completely deformed and sealed shut. The bow was tilted upward as if struggling in desperation, and the stern was shattered by a horrific explosion. How could such a sophisticated war machine be destroyed without even sending a single distress signal? Join us as we delve into the journey to uncover the terrifying truth behind this ghost ship. For more than 6 decades, the fate of U-455 was nothing, and many believed the submarine would never be found. That silence finally broke when a group of Italian divers led by Roberto Raldi descended into the cold waters of the Ligurian Sea. They were not searching for glory or headlines, but what they stumbled upon would shock the entire world. At a depth of about 400 feet, hidden beneath layers of mud and marine growth, a dark silhouette began to emerge. The shape was unmistakable. It was the hull of a German U-boat that had been missing since 1944. The bow of the submarine was tilted upward at a sharp angle, as if frozen in the act of trying to break the surface. That posture told a silent story, one of desperate struggle, where every man inside may have fought to bring the vessel back to life. Coral, seaweed, and shells had covered much of the outer steel, yet the outline remained intact enough to show it had been preserved like a tomb sealed in time. As the team swam closer, they noticed details that deepened the mystery. The periscope was still raised, pointing to the possibility that the submarine had been navigating just below the surface when disaster struck. Even more haunting were the hatches. Instead of being open, they were sealed tight, twisted shut by pressure and violence. That single fact meant there had been no attempt to escape. Every sailor who had gone to sea with U-455 remained trapped within the steel chamber, turning the vessel into a mass grave, resting silently beneath the waves. The stern told an equally terrifying story. The entire rear section of the submarine was shattered, the metal ripped apart in jagged fragments that suggested a massive explosion. Some believed the damage was caused by an external blast, perhaps from a mine or a depth charge, while others argued that an internal malfunction might have torn the vessel apart. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. The submarine had been destroyed so quickly and so violently that survival was impossible. The divers brought back photographs and reports, and soon naval historians joined the investigation. Mark and Luke Breyer, curators of the Atlantic Wall Museum, compared the wreck with naval archives. They discovered that only 3 German submarines had gone missing in the Mediterranean during that period. And the size, type, and location of the wreck matched U-455 perfectly. At last, after 66 years of questions, the lost submarine finally had a name. For the families of the men, the discovery was a moment filled with both pain and relief. For decades, they had nothing. No body to bury, no grave to visit, no answer to hold on to. Now, even though the truth was devastating, there was at least a place where mourning could take form. The wreck itself became a symbol of closure, a reminder that their loved ones had not disappeared into thin air, but rested together in the same steel coffin that had carried them to war. The haunting sight of the bow angled toward the surface, the sealed hatches, and the shattered stern made U-455 one of the most striking underwater discoveries of the last century. But if the wreck gave us the final resting place of the crew, could it also reveal the hidden truth about how U-455 met its end? During the Second World War, the German Navy relied heavily on its U-boats, and among them, the Type 6C submarines were the backbone of the fleet. They were called the Grey Wolves, a name that carried both fear and pride. For the Allies, the very idea of these submarines stalking convoys at night created an image of unstoppable hunters. And for Nazi Germany, that image became a powerful weapon of morale. Yet behind the image of glory was a very different reality. Life inside a U-boat was one of the harshest forms of military service. A Type 6C submarine like U-455 was just over 220 feet long and held around 50 men, all squeezed into narrow steel corridors. There was no real privacy, and every inch of space had to be used. Bunks were shared in shifts, meals were eaten beside torpedoes, and the smell of diesel fuel mixed with sweat and unwashed clothes. Fresh water was so limited that it was saved mostly for machinery, meaning sailors could go weeks without washing. The air was heavy with fumes, condensation dripped from the walls, and the constant hum of engines reminded the men that they were living inside a fragile machine designed for war. The stress was not only physical, but also mental. Patrols often lasted weeks, and silence filled most of those hours. Then, in an instant, alarms could ring, sonar pings would echo through the hull, and the crew would brace for the thunder of depth charges. Each explosion shook the submarine violently, leaving men unsure whether the next blast would split the steel around them. For propaganda, they were the elite, but in truth, they were ordinary young men enduring conditions few could tolerate. Their courage came not from a sense of invincibility, but from the discipline needed to survive each day. U-455 shared this story of endurance and struggle. Commissioned in 1941 under the command of Kapitän-Leutnant Hans Heinrich Giesler, the submarine began with patrols in the cold waters of Norway. Those early missions brought little success, testing the patience of the crew as they spent weeks submerged with nothing to show for it. Later, U-455 was redeployed to the Atlantic, where it finally found victories. The submarine sank at least 3 Allied ships, including the British Workman and the Geo H. Jones, totaling more than 17,000 tons of enemy shipping. For the men on board, those victories reinforced the belief that they were hunters who could challenge the might of the Allied fleets. But even as they celebrated those achievements, the tide of war was shifting. By 1943, new technology began to close the gap. Long-range aircraft patrolled the ocean skies, radar scanned for any sign of movement, and improved sonar made it harder for submarines to hide. Depth charges became more accurate and deadly, and the Atlantic, once the hunting ground of the Grey Wolves, turned into a graveyard for them. Germany had hoped that U-boats would be its trump card to starve Britain into surrender, but losses grew so high that many crews never returned. U-455 sailed during this dangerous time, when every mission carried the shadow of almost certain death. Still, for the sailors inside, duty carried them forward. They trusted their captain, they trusted their steel vessel, and they accepted the dangers as part of their role. When U-455 was chosen to attempt the passage into the Mediterranean, it was more than another assignment. It was a mission that tested not only the strength of the machine, but also the spirit of the men who lived within it. If propaganda painted the gray wolves as predators of the sea, why did U-455's final journey turn into one of the most desperate survival tests of the war? By January 1944, U-455 faced the most dangerous assignment of its career. The submarine had been ordered to leave the safety of Atlantic waters and slip into the Mediterranean, where Allied forces were pushing north through Italy. To reach that battleground, the crew had to pass through the Strait of Gibraltar, a narrow stretch of sea only 9 miles wide but packed with dangers on every side. For a U-boat, crossing Gibraltar was like walking into the jaws of a trap. The Allies knew submarines would try to enter, so the strait had been turned into a fortress. Radar and sonar stations scanned night and day, patrol ships circled constantly, and aircraft swept the skies ready to drop bombs or depth charges at the first sign of movement. Underwater mines filled the passage, turning the seabed into a deadly maze. To survive, U-455 would have to crawl forward in silence, trusting both the captain's skill and the strength of the steel that held them together. Condensation ran down the walls, mixing with diesel fumes until every breath tasted of metal and oil. The crew whispered instead of speaking, because even the smallest sound could betray their position to the destroyers hunting above. Every ping of Allied sonar was like a heartbeat pounding against the hull. Depth charges exploded in the distance, sending shockwaves that rattled the submarine like a tin can. Each detonation left the men wondering if the next one would tear the steel apart and flood the compartments in seconds. Hunger gnawed at them, nerves frayed, and the knowledge that one mistake could end 50 lives hung over every action. Yet despite the terror, discipline held the crew together. They trusted Captain Giesler, and they trusted each other. When the submarine finally cleared the strait, the relief must have been overwhelming. Against impossible odds, U-455 had survived what many considered a death sentence. For a brief moment, the men could believe that the hardest part was behind them. They had slipped past the fortress of Gibraltar and entered a new hunting ground. To them, the Mediterranean promised both danger and opportunity, a place where they could once again prove themselves as predators of the sea. But the reality was far darker. By 1944, the Mediterranean was no longer a place where submarines could dominate. Allied aircraft patrolled relentlessly, destroyers prowled the waters, and minefields stretched across vital passages. The hunters were now the hunted, and U-455 had sailed into a theater where survival was becoming rare. If the crew thought Gibraltar was the greatest challenge, what awaited them once they began their patrols along the Italian coast would prove even more deadly. After surviving the impossible crossing of Gibraltar, U-455 entered the Mediterranean with new orders from German Naval Command. The submarine was tasked to patrol the waters off the Italian coast, an area critical for Allied supply lines. Convoys carried food, fuel, and ammunition northward to support the landings at Salerno and Anzio, and every ton of cargo made a difference on the front lines. U-455 was expected to strike those lifelines and remind the Allies that the gray wolves still lurked beneath the waves. At first, everything seemed normal. A routine radio message was sent in early April 1944, confirming the new patrol zone and acknowledging the orders received. The communication carried no sign of trouble, no call for assistance, and no warning of malfunction. It sounded like the submarine was operating as planned. That short signal would become the last known contact with U-455. After it, silence took over, and the submarine vanished from every chart and record. For the German command, the disappearance was deeply troubling. Messages were sent out, waiting for any sign of the submarine, but nothing came back. Days passed, then weeks, and still there was no word. By the summer of 1944, the Kriegsmarine listed U-455 as missing, another addition to the long roll of submarines lost in the Mediterranean. Families received formal letters with cold wording, offering no explanation, only the grim acknowledgement that their loved ones were gone. For them, there was no closure, no grave to visit, only the unending weight of uncertainty. The sudden silence left room for countless rumors and theories. Some believed that U-455 had been caught in Allied minefields off the Ligurian coast, laid in secret to block German submarines from reaching supply routes. Others argued that the submarine had been spotted by Allied aircraft or destroyers and destroyed in an attack that left no survivors. A smaller group suggested that an accident might have doomed the vessel, perhaps a torpedo malfunction or a mechanical failure in the engine room. Without a wreck to examine, every explanation seemed possible, and none could be proven. What made the disappearance even more mysterious was the lack of debris. When ships were sunk on the surface, wreckage often floated for days, leaving behind oil slicks, lifeboats, or scattered cargo. U-455 left nothing. It simply dissolved into the sea, leaving families, historians, and even the German Navy with no clues to work with. The silence around U-455 became heavier with time, turning the story into more than just a military record. It became a wound carried by the families of 50 men who never came home. For the sailors inside, their final moments remain a blank space in history. They may have been minutes from surfacing when disaster struck, or perhaps they never even saw the danger coming. The unanswered questions would last for decades until divers finally uncovered the wreck in the early 2000s. But when the submarine was finally found, did the wreck provide clear answers, or did it only deepen the mystery of how U-455 met its end? When divers finally laid eyes on the remains of U-455, they saw more than twisted steel. Every angle of the submarine, every scar along its hull, offered silent testimony about its last hours. That posture alone suggested a desperate struggle, a crew fighting to bring the vessel back to life before disaster overwhelmed them. The most haunting detail was the raised periscope. Normally, this would be lowered deep underwater, but its position told investigators that the submarine had likely been operating just below the surface when it was struck. The crew might have been scanning for navigational points or watching for threats, unaware that danger was seconds away. The submarine had gone down instantly, trapping every sailor inside. Attention then turned to the stern, where the most visible damage appeared. This pattern indicated a powerful explosion, but the exact cause remained uncertain. What puzzled investigators was the lack of scattered wreckage. The submarine had not been blown into pieces, but had sunk in one unit, which made the disaster even harder to explain. The surrounding seabed added to the mystery. There were no signs of heavy debris fields, only the intact silhouette of the submarine lying like a monument beneath the water. Marine growth had covered much of the steel, but details such as rivets, frame outlines, and the shape of the hull remained visible. These clues confirmed beyond doubt that the wreck was U-455, one of only 3 German submarines unaccounted for in the Mediterranean during that period. For naval historians, the wreck was both a discovery and a puzzle. The upward angle of the bow told of a fight to the surface, the periscope revealed how close they were to daylight, and the shattered stern showed how sudden the end must have been. Together, the clues created a picture of 50 men working with everything they had, only to be crushed by a force they could not resist. The clues solved part of the mystery, but they also raised more questions about who or what delivered the fatal blow. If the wreck could not give a final answer, what do the competing theories reveal about the fate of U-455? The discovery of U-455's wreck gave historians physical evidence, but it did not solve the mystery of how the submarine was lost. Instead, it opened the door to three main theories, each supported by fragments of proof, yet none strong enough to close the case forever. The first and perhaps most tragic theory is that U-455 struck a German mine. Records show that the German Navy laid minefields along the Italian coast to block Allied movements, but communication was often poor, and updates did not always reach every submarine commander. If Captain Giesler was not warned, U-455 may have unknowingly sailed into its own Navy's trap. The damage at the stern fits this scenario, since a mine could have exploded directly behind the submarine, tearing away the rear section. If this were true, the crew would never have had a chance to react. Their end would have been almost instant, caused by the very weapons meant to protect them. The second theory argues that U-455 was destroyed by an Allied patrol. By 1944, the Mediterranean was heavily guarded, with destroyers sweeping the waters and aircraft flying constant missions. Allied sonar was precise, and depth charges were designed to explode at different levels, making it nearly impossible for a submarine to hide. The raised periscope on the wreck hints that U-455 was close to the surface, possibly spotted and attacked. The violent damage at the stern could match a depth charge detonation, and the absence of scattered wreckage suggests the submarine sank quickly, remaining intact as it dropped to the seabed. If this theory is right, then U-455 was one more victim of the increasingly effective Allied anti-submarine campaign. The third possibility focuses on an internal accident. Submarines carried dangerous equipment, from torpedoes filled with explosives to engines that push the limits of wartime technology. A sudden malfunction, perhaps in the torpedo room or engine compartment, could have created a blast strong enough to cripple the vessel. Some historians point to the fact that there was no clear record of an Allied kill, suggesting that U-455 might have destroyed itself. Yet none of them explains everything. If it were a mine, why was there no official record of the field in that exact area? If it were an Allied attack, why is there no confirmed report of the sinking? If it was an accident, why does the damage look so similar to an external blast? These unanswered questions keep the fate of U-455 locked in uncertainty. So while the wreck gave us the final resting place of the crew, it also left us with an unresolved puzzle. And if the theories cannot give us the full truth, what about the voices of those who once sailed aboard U-455 but escaped its final voyage? The story of U-455 is not only written in steel and seawater, it also lives in the memories of those who once served aboard her but escaped her final voyage. Two sailors, Gerhard Schwarz and Helmut Spitzer, were reassigned before the submarine sailed on its last mission. At the time, they may have felt frustration at being pulled from the crew, yet fate had spared them from sharing the same sealed tomb as their comrades. Their recollections gave the faceless names of the crew a human voice, a reminder that the 50 men inside U-455 were more than statistics in a naval report. Schwartz later stood on the shores of Genoa, staring out at the waters that had swallowed the submarine. For him, the wreck was not just a historical discovery, it was a grave holding the laughter, fear, and daily life of friends he had lived beside in the cramped quarters of a U-boat. He spoke of meals eaten beside torpedoes, of music played on a harmonica to break the silence, and of moments when even in darkness there was still companionship. Spitzer recalled the exhaustion of long patrols, the thrill of rare victories, and the heavy shift in morale when the tide of war turned against the German fleet. Their testimonies bridged the gap between the silent wreck and the living memory of what it meant to be part of the Grey Wolves. For the families of the lost crew, the discovery of U-455, decades later, finally provided a form of closure. The wreck became a place of mourning, a substitute for the graves they never had. International law now protects such wrecks as war graves, and divers treat them with respect, understanding that they are not just artifacts but resting places. U-455 stands today as a frozen reminder of sacrifice, of youth cut short, and of the ocean's power to hold secrets far longer than any government record. This transformation from feared predator to silent memorial offers a powerful lesson. The submarine once symbolized invincibility in propaganda, but now it speaks of fragility and loss. It reminds us that behind every machine of war are human beings caught in struggles beyond their control. But if U-455 has become a memorial under the sea, what larger meaning does its story carry for history and for us today? Thus, the ultimate secret of U-455 may forever belong to the ocean's depths. Yet perhaps, beyond the debates of torpedoes, mines, or technical failure, lies the most painful and truthful message. U-455, the Grey Wolf, that was once the terror of the Atlantic, was ultimately consumed by the very traps of the conflict it served, leaving behind a warning etched in silent steel. The quest to discover and explore the wreck was not merely about solving a mystery, it was a profound act of humanity. It tore through the veil of uncertainty that had shrouded the families for over half a century, granting them the most precious gift of all, closure. There on the cold seabed, U-455 ceased to be a killing machine and was transformed into a sacred war grave, a memorial for peace. Our duty is not to glorify or harbor hatred, but to remember, to learn the lessons, and to safeguard the peace that was paid for with millions of such lives. The faint light from the U-455 tragedy lies precisely in this. It proves that even amidst the remnants of death, humanity can still find resolution, understanding, and above all, hope for a world where secrets on the ocean floor remain only as stories of the past, never to be repeated.